Hi, friends. How are you today? Oh boy, so we are getting into the thick of Lions and Liars. Um, so our poor friend Frederick is wanting to get out of this camp, and he's still trying to keep his identity hidden and still pretend that he is Dashiell. Um, but I think the other campers are starting to catch on and they think something is fishy because he's not as cool as Dash should be. Um, but Specs is going to try to break in with Frederick into the camp counselor's office to use the telephone so that Frederick can call his mom. So here we go into chapter 10 of Lions and Liars, A Little Horse's Toothbrush. Frederick didn't want to break into Eric's office. He really didn't want to break into Eric's office with Specs. What he wanted was to just drop the whole breaking into the office thing and forget about it. Unfortunately, that was impossible. Let's do it now, Specs kept saying throughout the day. It seems it seemed like he was at Frederick's elbow every second, during lunch, on the character building afternoon hike, while they were learning to tie knots and do other aggression relieving crafts. Having Specs hiss into his ear, his breath hot on Frederick's neck, was annoying and a little bit frightening, and it made it impossible for Frederick to figure out how he was going to get out of this situation and back home where he belonged. Now, Specs whispered at dinner, it's a golden opportunity. No, Frederick whispered back, later. Too many people watching. He stabbed a Vienna sausage on a bent tined fork and looked sadly at it. Miss Betty was gone, and Merle, the cook who had replaced her, didn't arrange all the food neatly on the serving trays. Frederick didn't think there would be s'mores. Nobody's watching, Specs said. Everyone's right here. Eric's cabin is deserted. He'll probably go into his office after he eats, Frederick said, inventing yet another reason why they couldn't break in to use the phone. The professor, Nosebleed, and Antbite were silent. They had been silent on the matter ever since the river. They looked at Frederick with pity, but kept their mouths shut. He didn't blame them. He thought they were smart. He should have kept his mouth shut a lot more in his life, and maybe he wouldn't be here right now. I'll go with you, Specs said. I'll be your lookout, and then you can call your buddy on the outside. Frederick knew that Specs knew that he wasn't going to call some buddy on the outside, that he wasn't going to call some contact who would sneak him in contraband. Frederick suspected that Specs also knew that Frederick really did want to call his mommy. Frederick knew that Specs knew, and Specs knew that Frederick knew that he knew. Everybody knew, and yet they kept pretending that they didn't. It was like they were playing some complicated game where Specs and Frederick both had to pretend that Frederick was going to make a potentially illegal phone call. Frederick would lose the game if he admitted that he wasn't calling someone scary or shady. He would also lose if he told Specs to drop it because he had decided not to make a phone call after all. And Specs would win when he helped Frederick break into the office and listened in on Frederick's phone call with his mommy. Basically, there was no way for Frederick to win. So, really, all he was doing was postponing the moment when he lost. It was a horrible game, and Frederick didn't know how he wound up playing it. But here he was. Well, when are you going to be ready, Ding-a-ling? Specs asked. Later, Specs, Frederick answered. Yeah, right, Specs said. That is right, Frederick said, putting an end to the conversation. You're not going to do it, Specs said. Yes, Frederick said. I am too. Not, Specs muttered under his breath. After dinner, when the sun was sinking behind the pine trees, the campers went to their sleeping cabins. It was the first time Frederick had seen the inside of Group 13's cabin. It was one large room that smelled like fresh air, cedar, and barf. A moth fluttered against the bare light bulb in the middle of the low ceiling. There were 3 beds on one side of the room and 2 on the other. 4 of the beds already had sheets on them. Nosebleed, the professor, Antbite, and Specs each went to one of the made beds and collapsed. Ugh, Nosebleed groaned. The professor's feet hung off the end of his bed, and his head bumped the wall. He didn't seem to care. He opened his book and put it over his eyes to block out the light. Specs picked dead beetles off his bed and flung them at Aunt Bite. The fifth unmade bed had a folded stack of threadbare sheets on top of a stained mattress. The stain was shaped like a face with its mouth open, screaming in terror. At the end of the cabin was a porcelain sink with a dripping faucet. Frederick walked over to it and fiddled with the single tap. A slick of red algae rimmed the drain. While Frederick was taking all this in, Benjamin's voice called from outside. Dash! I found you some stuff in the lost and found. Their counselor lumbered into the cabin, carrying a cardboard box that he dropped on Frederick's bed. Frederick went over to the box. He pulled out an extra large red jersey and sniffed it gingerly. It smelled like cabbage. He dropped it on the mattress and peeled off his own nasty shirt. The jersey sleeves were so big they went past his elbows. The tail fell almost to his knees like a dress, at least it didn't have blood on it. And then he looked back into the cardboard box and pulled out a yellow flashlight, just like the one they had at home, only this one contained dead batteries. He also found a pair of men's loafers, mismatched socks, a book about girl spies, and a green-handled toothbrush. You don't have to use that, Benjamin said, pointing at the toothbrush Frederick was holding. I just saw it and thought of you. He laughed. How you were worried about your teeth, he added. The toothbrush's bristles were not tight and straight like a fresh out of the package toothbrush. They were gray and splayed and flattened. Whose toothbrush was this? Frederick asked. It looks like someone brushes a horse's teeth with it. Why would anyone brush a horse's teeth? The professor mumbled behind the pages of his book. Our horse would have a bigger toothbrush, Aunt Bite said, sitting up on the bed. What would you know about it? Specs said, flicking another beetle at him. Aunt Bite glared at him and lay down, rolling over to face the wall. Maybe it was a little tiny horse, Nosebleed said. He lifted his arms and held his two pointer fingers apart to indicate a 3-inch tall horse. Yeah, you don't have to use it, Benjamin said again, turning pink. Like I said, I just thought of you earlier, of our earlier conversation. He gave another laugh. Actually, maybe you shouldn't use it. You think? Said Specs. Benjamin took the toothbrush out of Frederick's hand and tossed it at the metal trash can by the door. He missed, and it clanged and it clattered to the floor. Good night, campers, Benjamin said. I'll see you tomorrow. He walked out of the cabin with a bounce in his step and closed the door behind him. They could still hear Benjamin's humming when Specs rolled off his bed and took a step toward Frederick. Now, Specs said, narrowing his eyes. At some point that day, Frederick had realized that the reason Specs squinted all the time was because he couldn't see clearly, because he really did need spectacles. So, it was a shame that he snapped his in twain. Not now, Frederick said. Then when? Specs said. You've put it off all day. You're not going to do it. When everyone's asleep, Frederick said, and he deliberately rolled his eyes. That was how fed up he was with Specs. He was so sick of him that he was forgetting to be scared. 1 hour, Specs tapped the face of the digital watch he wore. 1 hour, Frederick agreed. Not because he thought that was a good time, but because he was tired of arguing. After sleeping for only a few hours in a boat and then spending the day climbing a rope, swimming, hiking, and being scared out of his mind, Frederick was too exhausted to put the sheets of his bed on his bed properly. He dropped the fitted sheet on the floor and spread the top sheet so that it mostly covered the stain. Then he picked up his feet and fell face first on the bed. He was asleep before his eyelids were all the way closed. The next thing Frederick knew, someone was slapping the back of his head. Frederick groaned and tried to turn away from the slapping. It's time, ding-a-ling, Specs said. He held his watch right up to Frederick's nose. According to the green glowing face, it was 10:30. Frederick wanted to go back to sleep more than he'd ever wanted anything in his life. But he put but he put his hands on the bed and pushed himself up. Later, Frederick would marvel at the superhuman strength it took to wake himself from the deepest sleep he'd ever experienced to sneak across the camp for not yet transformed boys to try to break into a seriously creepy dude's office. And he would know that he found that strength deep within him, not because he was afraid of Specs, though he was afraid of Specs. And not because he wanted to call his mom to come pick him up, though he really, really hoped that he would get to do that. No, he was able to get up because he knew that if he didn't, Specs would say he had chickened out, and Frederick didn't want to give him the satisfaction. He stood up with his knees bent, bumping into the edge of his mattress. He patted himself like he was checking his pockets. His tennis shoes were still on his feet. He hadn't taken them off before falling asleep. He was wearing the baggy red jersey. He had no other possessions except some loafers, a dead flashlight, and a girl spy book. But he decided that he was ready to go. He stumbled through the dark cabin, past the other beds. He opened the door and stepped out into the night, catching his shoulder on the door jamb. Dang it, he muttered, rubbing his shoulder. Dang it? Specs mimicked Frederick and snickered. Is that the best you can do? You kiss your mama with that mouth? Nosebleed chuckled at his own joke. The professor, Nosebleed, and Antbite had also risen and were now following Frederick and Specs out of the cabin. Apparently, they were going with them to Eric's office, and that seemed right to Frederick. They were a group. They were going to do this together. Specs was right on Frederick's heels as he crossed the camp, sticking to the dark patches and staying out of the yellow glow beneath the floodlights attached to the buildings. The moon was bright tonight, and Frederick was able to make out his feet and a bit of the ground in front of him. The head counselor's office was a tiny cabin that was just off the main building. It faced the small parking lot where Frederick had first spotted the school bus and the campers. It was brighter here because the parking lot didn't have so many trees blocking the moonlight. Group 13 huddled close together in front of Eric's office. The lights were off inside. The head counselor must have already gone to his sleeping cabinet, Frederick hoped. Specs and Frederick were the only ones still in their day clothes. The other three were wearing pajamas. Nosebleed and Antbite had put on tennis shoes with their striped pants. The professor was barefoot. Specs reached out and shoved Frederick's arm. Frederick stepped away from the group. The two wooden steps that led to the porch were so rotten that each one sagged under his weight when he climbed. He stood in front of the door for a moment, listening hard, every sense on high alert, expecting Eric to materialize at any moment. Eric in his too tight shorts and his sunglasses, because Frederick got the feeling that Eric wore his sunglasses all the time, even in the dark, probably because he didn't have eyes, because he was a cyborg. What are you waiting for? Specs whispered from where the others stood. Frederick shook himself out of his daydream. Then he took a deep breath, grabbed the doorknob, and turned. Nothing happened. Frederick jostled the doorknob and tried turning it again, but it was locked tight. He twisted to whisper over his shoulder, "Now what?" He had never broken into anywhere before, and now that he had tried the front door, he was out of ideas. Nosebleed, Specs, and the professor and Antbite all climbed onto the porch. "Did you think it would just be unlocked?" Specs asked. "Yes," Frederick said, nodding. He had. He had thought that he would open the door and go into Eric's office and use the phone, and that would be a wrong thing to do because the campers weren't allowed in there. He hadn't thought they would actually have to break into the place like Mission Impossible type stuff. Maybe he should have brought along the spy book after all. Maybe he could have gotten some pointers. The others held a furious whispered conversation, most of which Frederick missed because he had leaned against the cabin wall and fallen into a doze while he was still standing. "We can pop the hinges out," Antbite said in a determined voice that cut through Frederick's slumber. Antbite was pointing at the edge of the door. Frederick and the others turned to look at the hinges at the top and bottom. Frederick had never noticed door hinges before. Were they on all doors? He guessed they must be. "How are we going to do that?" Nosebleed asked, rubbing the side of his head and gazing at the hinges in bewilderment, like he had never noticed them either. "A screwdriver and a hammer," Antbite shrugged. "Have you got a screwdriver and a hammer?" Specs asked. Antbite shrugged again. "Exactly," Specs said. "Well then, you've got to break the glass if you want to get in there," Antbite said, gesturing at the window beside the door. Through the window, Frederick could see a desk with stacks of paper all arranged in perfect piles, and on the corner of the desk, a big old-fashioned telephone. "If they find out you did it, they'll kick you out for sure," Nosebleed warned. "They'll call the police." They wouldn't call the police, and they aren't going to find out, Specs insisted. None of us are going to tell. Annoyance flashed through Frederick. None of us are going to tell, translated into somebody for sure is going to tell. And then the person who got told on always said, "You promised you wouldn't tell." And the person who told was always like, "No, I didn't." Can't we, I don't know, Frederick said. Can't we pick the lock? Can you pick a lock? Nosebleed asked hopefully. No, said Frederick. Then no, Nosebleed said, shaking his head. Break it, Specs said. Frederick hesitated. It's just a piece of glass, Specs urged. Nosebleed, Antbite, and the professor didn't say anything, but their silence roared in Frederick's ears. Frederick had never broken a window before. He had never broken anything on purpose. He had broken stuff by accident plenty of times, but breaking Eric's office window would be different. It would be mean and wrong. Frederick might have been a flea. He might have been a flounder and a dingaling, but he wasn't a bad person. Not yet. But maybe it was unavoidable. Maybe someone who screwed up as much as he did was bound to screw up at being a good person too. The thought made Frederick sad. He didn't want to become a bad person. He wasn't going to let that happen, he decided. At least, not tonight. He turned away from the window and climbed down the sagging steps to the ground. So you're not going to do it after all, Specs said from the porch. I knew you wouldn't. There was triumph in his voice. Even though the day had been hot, the air was cool now that the sun had set. Frederick tucked his fists into his armpits and squeezed his arms tight around himself. I didn't say I wasn't doing it, he said. And then, without really thinking about it, he started walking through the parking lot toward the 2-lane road that led away from camp. After the first few steps, he began walking with more purpose. If he didn't go back to the cabin, then Specs wouldn't say he had given up yet. He was just taking a break. What are you doing? Nosebleed called after him. I'm taking a break, Frederick called with some anger. Shh! The others all shushed from the porch. Behind him, he heard the professor swear softly, and then he heard the slapping of footsteps as the others ran to catch up with him. Hooey. Well, he may be a flea, he said, but he's not a bad person. And I wonder what our friend Frederick will be doing now. Our next chapter, the constellation Fleus Tinius, excuse me. I don't know what that's about, but stay tuned for next week.